Okay, so starting a new unit, the two things in this unit, actually three things: measurement and basic geometry, and then we're going to talk about some basic statistics to wrap up our last unit here. So kind of a little bit of an odd mix, but it ties everything together here to end the semester. This is our last unit.
Are you sure that can't be by?
Well, we've only got 4.5 weeks left. So we're going to start out today with measurement. Measurement really originated as a method of communications. If we were working on something, let's say we were both building a table or something in the shop and we're working together. Well, if we're working together, I can just say, hey, this piece needs to be this long, and you're across the room, you can make it that long or whatever. But if you're working in a different shop, across town or even down the road from me, I can't just hold up my hands and say, hey, it's this big. I've got to have some way of communicating that to you. I could cut a piece and have somebody run it down to you to use, but that got to be tedious. It helped to be able to write it down and send it that way. So I could have used, maybe I could use a pen and say, okay, I'm going to measure across this piece of paper, and I'm going to use the pen. I'm going to go, it's 1, 2, 2.5 pens long. But the problem is, I'm making the assumption that 1, you have a pen, and 2, that yours is the same size. If you use this pen to measure with, well, the considerably different sizes, you're going to get a different measurement. So they use things that, 1, pretty much everybody had, and 2, were pretty close to the same size. Mainly they used parts of the body. For example, let's start out with length measurement. If we're dealing with standard units, we're going to talk about length. Now first, a note on standard units. It used to be called the English or the British standard units. Back in the 1980s, England switched over to the metric system, which actually now for the last almost 30 years has left the United States as the only industrialized country in the world that's not on the metric system.
There are 2 other places in the world.
I said industrialized, though. Industrialized, though. There are 2 other places that are not on the metric system, but they're not heavy world traders.
No, they're kind of small.
Exactly. And I'm sure you guys have all heard it too. Back when I was in middle school 25 years ago or a little bit more, middle school science teacher saying within 10 years the United States is going to switch over to the metric system. Many of you probably heard the same thing much more recently than that. It will happen eventually. I'm not going to say it's going to be 10 years or anything like that, but it will eventually have to happen. Many of your large corporations that have international components, like IBM, about 3 years ago announced all of their production is going to be done metric, whether it's United States or foreign or not, just because of the amount of money they were spending on designing everything and having to convert units and all that stuff. They figure they're saving tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars a year by just designing and producing everything in metric, period. So anyway, let's talk about units of length. Probably the first unit of length that was used was the inch. Anybody know where the inch came from? The inch was the distance from the end of your thumb to the point of that first knuckle. So if I were going to measure my piece of paper here in inches, I would literally go 1, 2, 3, and count, the inches along that paper. Notice that little motion too, by the way, that little rolling motion. If you guys ever hear of an inchworm, that's where that comes from. It kind of moves that rolling motion. But anyway, what's that, the little inchworm? I never had that book when I was a kid. Yeah, I'm deprived.
I'll bring it to you.
There you go. But anyway, most everybody had at least one thumb. And for the most part, they were pretty close to the same size. So the inch was a fairly reliable unit of measurement. Now, I see some of you looking at your thumbs. One thing to note, and it's not a discriminatory comment at all, but you got to remember this all started 12, 1500 years ago. The difference between a man and a woman's thumb is actually significant, but measurement was being done primarily by men at that time. So the size difference was not a huge difference from one person to the next. Bigger than an inch. What's our next unit that we usually use? A foot. Pretty obvious where a foot comes from. Distance from the end of your big toe to the back of your heel. How many inches are in a foot? 12. We are used to there being 12 inches in a foot. Not necessarily the case if you go to compare. Actually, back in the 500s, King Edward declared that his thumb was going to be the official inch of the land and his foot was going to be the official foot, and things like that. His foot did not have 12 of his inches in it either, but it was relatively close. A few hundred years later, long after King Edward was dead, because he would have beheaded him for doing it while he was alive, they adjusted the length of the inch in the foot to make it so there's 12 inches in a foot. Now, that's a significant step. When King Edward made that declaration, that's a significant step in measurement. Before then, if you think about measuring up the wall, the wall here at the side of the room, you wouldn't want to do that in inches because inches are too small. It'd take too many of them. And every time you move, that's a little bit of an error there. So you'd want to use a bigger unit. So the foot would make sense. In fact, that's what we would measure that wall in right now, is the height would be measured in feet. But at that time, I could not have measured this wall in feet. Can anybody tell me why? Well, unless I chop my leg off at the ankle, I can't get my foot up to the ceiling, can I? So using your foot to measure vertical things like vertical heights was not practical. You couldn't get your foot up that far. The foot was actually used primarily to measure things, the length of things that were close to the ground. Like if I wanted to measure the length of the wall along the floor, I would use a foot for that. Measuring heights, we would use a unit called the hand. Now I write it off up to the top here because we just don't use it anymore. A hand, well, they still use it for measuring the height of all livestock. Yes, the hand was the distance across the width of the hand at the fingers here, at the base of the fingers. And then one hand is approximately 4 inches. Now again, that was, King Edward's was not exactly 4 inches. They adjusted it later to make it fit.
Is that still true with animals then?
Yes, they still use the hand. They stack the hands up. And it's about 4 inches. Yeah. Larger than a foot. There are some units that were used. There's the fathom. We don't use that anymore. A fathom was actually the height of the tallest sailor on the ship. That was the minimum depth that most of your large vessels could navigate through in the water. Had to be 1 fathom deep.
So did you just drop the guy overboard?
Well, he just jumped in the water, and if it went over his head, it was at least a fathom deep. They also had rope.
I like that.
So
They also had ropes with weights and knots in them that they used.
Put on the guy's neck before they drop
So you pull them back, yeah.
you really don't want to be that guy.
You don't want to
No.
be the guy.
There's the furlong, or not the furlong, the cubit was actually used in construction. The cubit was the distance from the tip of your middle finger to the point of your elbow. Now, if you look at that distance on most men is about 16 inches. If you look at construction, most of your spacings, stud spacings, joist spacings, and stuff like that are still at about 16 inches, about 1 cubit apart. Again, that's kind of a dead unit. We don't use it anymore.
IT or IT? Cubit?
Cubit, yeah, IT. But again, we don't use that anymore. The next one that we use would be the yard. The yard is how many feet? About 3 feet. Well, it's exactly 3 feet. The yard, actually, most people think of the yard as being the length of a person's pace when they take a stride. And it is approximately that length, but that's not where it came from. The yard actually was from the outstretched hand to either the center of the chest or the point of your nose. It was used by tailors for measuring fabric. They'd grab the fabric, pull it out, and at their nose, that was 1 yard of fabric. Bigger than a yard, like we said, there's a fathom, there's furlongs, there's stuff like that. There is one that we're going to use that you might not be so familiar with. It's called the rod. A rod is 5.5. We're going to put it down as 5.5 yards, or 16.5 or 16.5 feet. A rod, excuse me, a rod was originally a shepherd's tool. The shepherd had a rod and a staff. The staff was that little Bo Peep style hook that they used to hook the animals around the neck so you could detain them and do whatever you needed to with them. The rod was really just a big stick. It was a defensive weapon. If animals threatened the flock, it was used to literally chase them off or actually fight them off. You think of 16 and a half feet, that's about twice the height of the ceiling. It seems like a pretty big stick. And what they did was they literally took a sapling tree, cut it off, and took the branches off of it, and that's what they used. But on the realistic side of it, practical side, you look at it, if you're fighting off a wolf with nothing more than a stick, you might want a little distance between you and him.
Yeah. All I have to say to you is good luck.
Yeah. Oh, I'd be hiding behind one of the other sheep saying, "Here, take the little one." Where a rod became used as a unit of measurement. Let's say Cody has some sheep and I have some sheep, and we send them, they're off down in the valley grazing. At the end of the day, we go to get our sheep, and I say, well, I had 13 sheep, and Cody says, well, I had 12 sheep, and there's only 19 sheep there. One or both of us is lying. I'm voting for Cody. Sorry. But how do you figure out whose is whose? Well, with cattle, they settled that argument very definitively by branding them. That didn't work well with sheep for a couple of reasons. One, the sheep's skin was a little more delicate. Branding did a lot more damage to them. Two, their fur tended to grow out pretty thick, so after a few days you couldn't see the brand anyway. The wool grew over it. And third, and not insignificant, wool is just a touch flammable. Take a brand to the sheep, it's going to go poof.
Bye-bye. Yeah, at least we have mutton.
Sure. And at that point, ear tags and stuff like that were not developed. They were not readily available. Most people didn't have access to them. So identifying your animals was not going to be simple. So it was actually the sheep herding aspect was where land ownership and land division actually came into play. They would find a landmark, like let's say they'd take the tall tree on the hill, and they say, okay, well, this is going to be your pasture land, this is going to be my pasture land, let's keep our sheep separate. That way we don't have to fight over whose is whose. And to figure out, to make sure they had the same amount of land, or that land was divided up fairly, one of the shepherds would take his rod and he'd lay it down on the ground. That'd be one. The next one would put his end to end. There's two, and they just keep flip-flopping them end to end and measure out, okay, this is 30 rods this way and 45 rods that way. We have the same amount of land. To this day, by the way, if you look at a legal description for a land survey, it will say that the southeast corner is so many rods north and so many rods west of this landmark. It's all done in rods still. So that's the only reason I mention it, is that for land ownership, your surveys are done in rods. There are several that are bigger than rods. I mentioned furlongs and others. We're going to jump from there up to miles. A mile is how many feet? 5,280. Anybody know how many yards?
No.
1,760 yards. So, the mile. There are some rumors out there about the mile was the distance King Edward could see from his throne. That's not really true. The mile actually came from the Greek and Roman militaries. The Latin prefix mil means 1,000. A mile was actually the distance that soldiers in formation would travel if they marched 1,000 paces. A pace was starting on your left foot, going to your right foot, and then back to your left foot was considered a single pace. So 1,000 paces was a mile, which came out to be about 5,280 feet. So those are our units of length. Let's look at the units of weight. We're going to start out with the large one. Our largest unit of weight that we typically use is a ton.
And what's the difference between metric ton and weight?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
How big is a standard ton?
55 pounds.
2,000 pounds is what we're used to it being called. A ton was originally used for buying and selling grain. The 2,000 pounds is what 99.99% of the time when you hear the word ton, that's what they're talking about. That is actually what is called a net or a short ton, which implies that there's something called a gross or a long ton. A gross ton is actually 2,240 pounds. Why is there a difference? Well, it's the words net and gross are the ones that are the most descriptive there. If you have a job, if you look at your gross paycheck, if you work 40 hours a week at $9 an hour, that's $360. That should be your gross pay. That would be everything. But you don't get that much. They take out taxes and other stuff, so you get something less than that, which is your net. Same thing here. A ton of grain, you couldn't just throw it on a scale. It would run off, so it had to be in a container. The container that held about a ton of grain was about 240 pounds. So with the container, a gross ton was 2,240. Without the container, it was 2,000. So we've talked about the pounds. The abbreviation for pounds is actually LB, from the Latin word for pound, meaning libra. The reason that was done, as we mentioned, pounds and tons was used in buying and selling mostly of grains and food. In the bookkeeping system for that, PD, which would be the most logical abbreviation for pound, was already being used for paid. So they didn't want to confuse the two. Smaller than a pound, we have ounces. How many ounces are in a pound?
I want to say 12.
16 ounces in a pound. The abbreviation for ounces, by the way, is OZ. Smaller than an ounce, we have
What a milligram.
drams.
Right.
Not grams, drams. A gram is metric. A dram is standard. There are 16 drams in an ounce. A dram was one of the original apothecary units. You might get prescribed an eighth of a dram or a 16th of a dram of medication. There's also something called grains that was used. Grains has now been absorbed into the metric system because it was mostly for medical purposes. 1 pound was 7,000 grains, and that was grain. Literally, if you're like looking at salt, is like each little crystal or little chunk of salt was a grain. And they would literally have to count out the little grains of the medication. So you might get prescribed, 40 grains of a medication per dose or whatever. Now, one thing I want to note here, these are the units you're going to have to know. You're going to have to know the 2,000 pounds and the 16 ounces and so on. But you hear a lot on the news about gold has reached, $1,800 an ounce or whatever. Silver is, actually it's way down now, but it's like $30 or $40 an ounce. It was up in the 70 or 80s for a while. They are not talking about these ounces, by the way. Precious metals are bought and sold in something called troy measurement. Troy measurement is actually from the island of Troy in the old Greek Roman areas. In troy measurement, 1 troy pound is approximately 0.83 regular pounds. And there are only 12 troy ounces in a troy pound. So even though a troy pound is less than a regular pound, a troy ounce is actually slightly more than a regular ounce. We're not going to ever be quizzed on that in this class, but it's just something to be aware of. That when you're talking about gold, silver, and other precious metals, they're not talking about regular ounces and regular pounds. So that is weight. Let's talk about volume. Volume, let's go from a larger unit again. We're going to start out with gallons. Gallons was actually a standard, well, actually from two things: a standard bucket size and also a standard hat size. Most of your cowboy hats, if you filled them up, held about 1 gallon. But anyway, a gallon is a pretty standard unit of volume for us. Smaller than a gallon, we have what? Quarts. Does anybody know how many quarts are in a gallon?
12,
There are 4.
4.
The word quart actually comes from the word quarter. It's a quarter of a gallon. So there's 4 of them in a gallon.
Quarters that old.
The quarters, a fourth has been around for a while, yeah. Smaller than a quart. Pint. Liters metric. How many pints are in a quart? 2 pints in a quart. Smaller than a pint. A half pint used to be called a half pint. Now it's called a cup. 2 cups. If it was called a half pint, obviously there's 2 of them. A bit of a note, a little warning here between quarts and pints, by the way. Quarts abbreviated QT, pints PT. In a lot of your type fonts, a Q and a P look the same, just mirror images. Be very careful. I see people mixing those up a lot.
Because the difference between pints and 2 cups.
Just a little bit.
You want 2 pints and 2 cups.
Smaller than a cup. We have what?
No.
Fluid ounces, exactly.
Oh.
1 cup is 8 fluid ounces. Smaller than a fluid ounce. 1 fluid ounce is 2. I'll write it out. Tablespoons. Abbreviation for tablespoon, by the way, can be kind of tricky.
Capital T O B S.
Could be a capital T BSP. Could be a small t BSP. Could be just a capital TSP, or sometimes abbreviated, most commonly now, with just a capital T. And you'll see why that's confusing in just a second.
But in the cookbooks, it's TBL and TSP is teaspoon.
Well, if there's ever a capital T on it, it is tablespoon.
Then a man wrote
And
it.
it's TBL.
TBL is also tablespoon.
Yeah. And
But you've also seen tablespoon abbreviated just a capital T. If it's a teaspoon, let's give that 1 tablespoon. I'm going to use the TBSP. Is 3 teaspoons. And abbreviations for teaspoon are just small TSP or a small t. So it can be very confusing because the abbreviations look very similar. And in fact, TSP is an acceptable abbreviation for both. It's just the tablespoon, it has to be a capital T.
So what then you mark it wrong if you do 1 T.
If it's the wrong abbreviation, it's wrong.
I'm going to say it's supposed to be always capital T, but it's not always capital T.
For the
You're going
tablespoons,
to do that,
always,
and you're doing things, no. It's not.
occasionally it's not. Occasionally you'll see a TBL or TBSP. Yeah.
well, this is going to be really hard because I'm a cook and that's what I write.
And a lot of
And-
times it is a small.
As long as I can tell which one you mean, I'm okay with it.
Well, it's gotta be in.
Now, since you do some cooking, you'll like these other 3. These you don't have to write down because I'll never test you on them. But everybody's heard them, and most people don't realize that they are actual real units. Smaller than a teaspoon. You have 2 dashes in a teaspoon. A dash contains 3 pinches. And a pinch contains 2 smidgens. A dash, we're not talking about your typical salt shaker here. We're talking about a spice shaker, which is just a larger version of a salt shaker. It's just one turn and shake of the shaker. That's a dash. A pinch is literally you reach in with your fingers and you pinch together, and what comes out between your fingers is a pinch. I'm going to say about 3 of those in a dash. A smidgen, which I think is maybe a little bit nasty, you just stick your finger in, and whatever sticks to your finger, you flick that in. That's a smidgen. But they do actually make measuring spoons for these. I have a good friend of mine who's a caterer, and she actually has the measuring spoons for them. No, a good cook doesn't. Like for her,
Doesn't use recipes.
for a cup, the cup actually comes from your cupped hand, and I've watched her dump sugar in it. I've double checked her, and she's dead on just about every time. But also for a tablespoon, she does the same thing. She just dumps it in the crease of her hand, and she knows how much it is. And,
Yeah, no, I just kind of throw stuff into cooking.
sure. Well, there's a difference between cooking though and baking. When you're baking, you don't really get to sample as you go, and you can't really bake by taste very much.
Oh, that's so not true.
Well, there's some
So
some things you can taste the batter, but you know what I
Everything
mean.
you can taste when you're tasting.
Yeah, you got a point. But when you're baking, the final result is different than what
You're not
the
good.
steps are.
You're not good.
Eh,
Anything you have.
obviously, I haven't gone too hungry in my life. So obviously, I haven't gone too hungry in my life. So anyway, those are our units for length, weight, and volume. Now the next thing I want to look at is how to do conversions with them. I'm not going to go into time because I think pretty much all of us realize there are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day. So I'm not going to insult you by going over those. But converting within our other units, if we had 3 feet and I asked you to convert that to inches, most of you could just do that by saying what? 3 times 12. We know that going from feet to inches, you multiply by 12 to get the result. But technically what you're doing there is you're doing a conversion where you're going to take that 3 feet and we're going to make it a fraction by putting it over 1. Then we're going to convert. We're going to get rid of feet. So I'm going to put feet on bottom so that in our multiplying our fractions, the feet cross cancel out. I'll put inches on top. And we know that 1 foot equals 12 inches. So now when we multiply, like I said, the feet cross cancel out. We have 3 times 12 inches is 36 inches. 1 times 1 is 1, so it's 36 over 1 or just 36 inches. The reason this works is, remember when we were working with fractions, let's say we had 3/4 and we wanted to change it into 12ths. We multiplied by 3 on top and bottom, right? We multiplied by 3 over 3. Well, 3 over 3 is equal to what? 1. When you multiply by 1, you may change the appearance, but you don't change the value of anything. Well, this here, even though it doesn't look like it, 12 inches over 1 foot is still equal to 1, because 12 inches and 1 foot are the same length. So we are technically still multiplying by 1. So we're not changing the value, we're just changing the appearance. 3 feet and 36 inches are the exact same length, we're just changing the appearance of it. Now for feet and inches, you don't need to do that because most of us are very used to converting between feet and inches. But we might run into a problem like this. "99 feet equals how many rods?" Well, I would go ahead and I'd do my 99 feet, make it a fraction, put it over 1. Now here I'm going to have feet on bottom so they cross cancel out. Rods on top. What's my relationship between feet and rods? 1 rod is 16.5 feet. So now the feet cross cancel. 99 times 1 rod is 99 rods. 1 times 16.5 is 16.5. I divide that out, I get 6 rods. So there, since it's a unit that we're not so familiar with, we don't use that often, using those conversion factors is helpful. Another thing I'm going to mention here, always look at the units and make sure the units make sense when you're converting. A rod is bigger than a foot. If the unit gets bigger, the number must get smaller. So we're going from feet to rods, the number has to get smaller. We went from 99 down to 6. That makes sense.
What if we go rods to feet?
Well, then the unit's getting smaller, so the number has to get larger.
So 100 rods is how many feet?
So we've got 100 rods converted into feet. Do the same thing. 100 rods over 1. We're going to put rods on bottom now so they cross cancel out. Feet on top. 1 rod, 16.5 feet. Rods cross cancel. 100 times 16.5 feet is 165. Oops, sorry. 1,650 feet over 1, so it's just 1,650 feet. So 100 rods is pretty big. 320 rods is a lot.
Okay, I'm gonna have fun with that now.
Yeah,
How many rods in a mile?
320.
Okay, go 320 rods that way, then take the left after, and continue and go 100 yards back. And then you can,
Okay, let's talk a little bit about metric. Or metric units. In the metric system, there's only one unit for each thing. For length, our unit is the meter. All lengths are measured in meters or fractions of a meter. For volume, it is a liter. Now for weight, we have to be careful. There's a difference between weight and mass. Weight is the force of gravity exerted on an object. Mass is actually the amount of material in an object. We tend to use them interchangeably on Earth, mainly because gravity is constant on Earth, so something with the same mass is going to have the same weight. But if you get deep into the scientific side of things, there is a difference between weight and mass. However, in common practice, and especially in the medical fields, where you'd think it would be more important to be precise, mass and weight are used interchangeably. Technically, in the standard system, pounds, ounces, tons is a unit of weight. You're measuring the force that gravity pulls on an object. There is a unit of mass in the standard system called the slug, but if you're not an engineer, you've probably never heard of that. In the metric system, what we tend to use is grams. That's actually a unit of mass, not a unit of weight. It's a measurement of how much matter or how much material is inside of an object. The unit of weight in the metric system is actually the Newton. But again, if you're not an engineer or a scientist, you've probably never heard of a Newton before. A Newton is a unit of force. Partly because your typical 220 pound person is about 100 kilograms. That'd be 980 newtons of weight. Nobody wants to say they weigh 980 of any unit. But now what if we wanted to measure something larger than a meter or liter or a gram or smaller than one of those units? We use prefixes. We start out with the prefix deci. Deci is the metric or the word for 1/10. So a meter, of course, is abbreviated M, a gram is abbreviated G, a liter is abbreviated L. So a deciliter or decimeter, decimeter is DM, deciliter DL, decigram DG, is 1/10 of a meter or liter or gram. A quick note here, by the way, on liter. You'll notice that I always abbreviate liter with a capital L because that's how I was taught to do it, that it had to be a capital L. Because way back when, on most of your typewriters, the small l and the number 1 were almost identical. So if you had something like this, they didn't want you to, oops, just like that, they didn't want you to be confused, is that 51 or is that 5 liters? If you used a capital L, it was very obvious that was 5 liters. Now with your more sophisticated computer type fonts, L and a 1 are usually distinguishable, so it is acceptable to use a small L for liters. You'll just always see me use a capital L because that's what I'm used to. So deci was 1/10. Smaller than deci is centi, which is 1/100th. So a centimeter is 100th of a meter. A centiliter is 100th of a liter. A centigram is 100th of a gram. What's that? Centigram, oh yeah. Smaller than that is milli. Milli, we said the Greek Roman prefix mil means 1,000. Milli means 1,000th. So a millimeter, mm, is 1,000th of a meter. Milliliter is 1,000th of a liter. Milligram is 1,000th of a gram.
And there you go.
Now on a side note, we use these standard units a lot. Milli gets used a lot, 1,000th. Deci and centi don't get used that much. When they developed the metric system, and believe it or not, the metric system was actually developed back in the 1880s. So it's been around for 120, 130 years. They developed all those units just because they thought it would be nice to have, all those other units in there. In practice, they just weren't needed. The decimeter wasn't necessarily needed. Centimeter, actually, the centimeter gets used a lot in the United States because the centimeter is the unit closest to an inch, and we're so ingrained with the inch that we tend to use centimeters. But in Europe and other countries that have been on the metric system longer, it's usually millimeter or meter. They don't use the centimeters hardly at all.
Isn't the decimeter used a lot in country work?
No.
I sure, I use it.
A decimeter? It's not used a whole lot, no.
Doing little things though, which I've done,
Yeah.
I use it more, so
It's possible, yeah. The one that I see used the most is the deciliter. In the medical fields, all your blood testing is done in milligrams per deciliter of blood.
I don't even know what that
Like if you get you get a blood sugar level of 105, that's 105 milligrams of blood glucose per deciliter of blood is what that's saying. Or your cholesterol levels that you get, that is milligrams of HDL or LDL per deciliter of blood.
Hey, Jason had a reducing math problem. Convert the math to sum into
Okay, now going smaller, we don't go every 10 anymore. We went 1/10th, 100th, 1/1000th. Well, we don't do a 10,000th, 100,000th. We skip right to a millionth. 1 millionth is the abbreviation micro. The prefix micro. The symbol for micro is the Greek letter mu. Looks like that. I think it was a U with a long tail or a P that never closes on top, or however you want to look at it. It's the Greek letter mu. But the profession that used micrometers, micrograms, actually was the biggest thing. The most was the medical profession. That was also the first profession that started typing everything, keyboarding everything into a computer for electronic records. There is no mu key on your computer keyboard. So they started using MCG for micrograms. So I'm not going to put down any abbreviations for those. I mean, your textbook, I'm pretty sure, uses the mu for micro. But just be aware in common practice, a lot of times MC is used in place of that just for convenience. And there are units that are smaller than micro. There's a billionth, which is nano. Probably heard a lot about nanotechnology in the news and other advertisements in the last few years. Nanotechnology is nothing more than dealing with stuff that's really, really tiny. A millionth of a meter would be basically taking a piece of hair and chopping it into about 1,000 pieces. The long way, not the narrow way, not in length. So it's really tiny. The size of an atom is usually between 5 and 15 nanometers. Going larger than a meter, liter, or gram, we have the prefix deca. Now, small d has already been used for deci as our abbreviation. Deca means 10, by the way. So they use DA. So DAM is a decameter, that's 10 meters. DAL is a decaliter. DAG is a decogram. Larger than that was hecto. Hecto is 100. So HM, a hectometer, is 100 meters. HL is 100 liters. HG is 100 grams, a hectogram. Just like the other side, those two don't get used hardly at all. You almost never hear of a hectometer. You occasionally hear of a decameter. That's the one you sometimes hear used in construction, the decameter. But at least I've used in construction, seen used in construction for lot sizes and stuff like that as a decameter.
You've done it, I guess. Mine's
Yeah.
been little.
Sure. The one that gets used the most, kind of like the milli on the other side, is kilo. which is 1,000. So a kilogram is 1,000 grams, kilometer is 1,000 meters, kiloliter is 1,000 liters. Actually, the kiloliter doesn't get even used that much. 1,000 liters is like 270 gallons. It's a little large. But kilogram is about 2.2 pounds. That's what's used typically for, even though it's technically a unit of mass, that's what's typically used for human weight. Kilometers is about 0.6 miles. So that's usually what's used for traveling distance and stuff like that. Bigger again yet. Just like on the other side, we stopped going up by tens and we skip. So the next one we go up to is mega. You notice I used a capital M there. Mega is a million. And it is abbreviated with a capital N since small m is used for milli. So capital M with a small m is a megameter, which is a million meters. Capital M with a small g is a megagram, a million grams. Or, of course, capital M with an L is a megaliter, a million liters. The only one there that gets used much is the megagram. The megagram, which is a million grams or 1,000 kilograms, is often referred to as the metric ton. In just a second. Like 2 minutes. So the metric ton is 1,000 kilograms, which is slightly larger. It's about 2,200 pounds.
Are you sure megagram doesn't get used a lot?
Well, it doesn't get called a megagram. As a metric ton, it gets used quite a bit with trade, but that's about it.
Metric ton is 1,000 kilograms.
1,000 kilograms, or a million grams. In the metric system, they planned some things out very, very well. Measurement had been used for thousands of years with the standard units at that point, and they kind of got thrown together to make a system. The metric system was actually planned out. They saw the flaws in the standard system, so they planned around them. 1 milliliter, for example, was planned out to be 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, a cube that was 1 centimeter on the side. So 1 milliliter is literally 1 cubic centimeter, 1 centimeter cubed, which made conversions pretty nice. Whereas in the standard system, 1 gallon is approximately 231 cubic inches. That's not such a nice conversion. Or 1 cubic foot is 7.48 gallons. Again, not so nice of a conversion. 1 gram was defined to be the mass of 1 milliliter of water. So again, if you have something that is close to the density of water, you can actually convert between volume and mass. We'll talk more about those when we come back. Let's take our